if you got a Boy Scout who paid attention, they could go up into the mountains, find some rocks and some fucking sticks, and make themselves tools, be able to make themselves a log cabin, or a kayak, or a canoe, out of what's out in nature. If you read your Boy Scout handbook, it'll teach you how to do that. Boy Scout handbook, Trail to Eagle. Forget the politics, get the book. Alright, so there's a lot of stuff that is non-replenishable. This is the logistics aspect. Copper is not necessarily a replenishable resource. Depends on where you're at. Would it be beneficial for Polynesians to bring bronze tools from Asia to North America? No, not really. Cost to weight ratio is immense. There's also the chances of losing an entire cargo. That would have been very expensive. Other than large islands like New Zealand, there wasn't a whole lot of resources. In some areas, the Polynesians were primarily hunters, and other areas, they were primarily agriculturists. But they did trade with China, often and frequently. Same thing with Japan and Korea. We do have a lot of evidence of this, but we don't have a lot of evidence of them giving a shit about anything made of bronze. It's obvious that they were trading with the Chinese 3,000 years ago. So if the Polynesian people 3,000 years ago were trading with China, and we've got boats from the Aleutian Islands that are at least that old, they say the oldest boat on Earth is the Khufu ship. And that's partially true. We've got the remainders of canoes that are older. Sorry, kayaks, not canoes. And we do have seagoing flatboats, is what they're called, but they're not really flat. Let's get to the oldest metal tools on Earth. Copper tools found around Milwaukee. That's in Wisconsin. Where is the fence post village? First of all, it's not a village. They found all these fence post holes. They weren't actually holes. They'd been filled in with more recent dirt, but that's how they were able to find them, because the more recent dirt is a different color than the dirt that originally was there. The dirt they had to dig out in order to put a fence post there. Turns out they weren't fence posts. They were posts for wooden houses. If you got a lot of wood, wood is a lot lighter weight than a lot of materials you'll find out in nature that you can build with. If you cover them properly, you can make them last for, well, in some cases, thousands of years. There are 1,000-year-old oak beams in some of the churches in England and also in France. 1,000-year-old beams. The ones at Notre Dame were pretty close to that. Westminster Abbey was built in 1066. So, in about 43 years, those beams will be 1,000 years old. Of course, they were probably felled 2 to 3 years prior. You don't want to use wood that's still green on a structure like that because it's going to have some sort of shrinkage over the first 2 to 3 years. Majority of it in the first year. Now, when we look at the tools that are used in different areas, the Polynesians, the tools they were able to use in order to make their boats, it's all stuff that's locally sourced. If you break a drill bit, you don't have a metal drill bit. You just go get another piece of coral. It's genius. Self-sufficient. That's one of the things about the Alaskan natives. There's also a lot of evidence that we've been finding recently. I don't say we as in me. I mean, there's a lot of archaeological excavations going on with the ice melts. We're finding kayaks all over the place. But when we look at the kayak, same thing, self-sufficient. Where are you living? Everything that you have is specifically for that. Any homeless person who started off homeless with six bags of shit they didn't need, by the end of it, they want to save their back, they want to save their legs, and they end up most of the time with a blanket or a sleeping bag and a tarp of some sort to keep the rain off you. That's pretty important. That's your shelter. Now, it's the same thing up north. You got very simplistic ideas. Well, the way the culture used to be. There was a documentary that I was watching about how many people up north are dependent upon government subsidies. They didn't do for the people up north what they did for the Polynesians who had, there was an island where catamarans, the first catamarans were basically 3 logs slashed together. Now, there was a storm that came by and washed nearly all of those away from an island that was dependent entirely on those boats for sustaining their society. And so a company donated a whole bunch of boats, a whole bunch of catamarans that are fiberglass. They're built the same specifications, or the same lines, I should say, as the originals, but they're lighter weight. They're also not sustainable. On that island, they don't have anything to sustain fiberglass. So eventually they're going to have to go back to the ancient ways. And how long are those fiberglass boats going to last? Well, they'll probably use them until 50, 60 years down the road. How many people are going to have forgotten that knowledge? So we've got Polynesians who are obviously trading with China, obviously trading with South America, obviously trading with North America. But the oldest tools that we have are from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the oldest copper tools. And some of them, like on the front cover of this, the one that's in the center, is considered to be a European design. 2 other ones are Asiatic designs. Another one is an African design, except they're made of copper and not bronze. That's because you can source copper locally and easily. They showed the process by which you had to make copper back in the day, but then you look at the tools and you go, well, that's not the way they did it. It's obvious that their tools were made of ingots, natural ingots, hammered, of course, but they started off as ingots nonetheless. When you find natural copper, it's a very bright green or bluish green color. It sticks out like a sore thumb. And when you pick it up, you know you got something special. You can still find these in the Rocky Mountains from time to time. Just a bright blue stone last time I found one. It was probably about that tall, probably about that wide. It was a pretty big piece. It wasn't like a round stone by any means. It looked like, how do you explain it? It kind of looked like a small piece of coral. But you can go to break it off, and when you break it off, the blue stuff falls off, and it exposes the copper itself. Very bright color. Now with bronze, that requires mixing it with tin, and I'm sorry, I gotta blow my nose. A little chilly here in Oregon today. That's the weather we got. That's my window. Alright, so let's get back to the studies, right? So, we've got the Aleutians, the Aleutian Islands, and we've got a lot of the societies that lived around there, and some of them still do. And we take a look at what they made everything out of. It's all stuff that's locally sourced, stuff that they could find. One of these seagoing kayaks was made out of, well, most of them were made out of driftwood. They're made in shops now with wood that's nicely cut with modern tools and modern equipment, but back in the day it was driftwood. One of these kayaks that they said it had like 17 different types of wood in it. That would have been likely from traveling around and repairing it in different places. One of the things they were showing about the kayak that was made in the 1970s, it was made to show that these things actually worked, because although these kayaks were still in use in 1910, matter of fact, there were still even a few of them in use back in the 1940s. They were used during the Aleutian campaign for the United States versus Japan. But not very many were left by that point. They still exist, but it's a different way of life. All these modern tools. You can't be simplistic anymore. Now you have to have all this extra weight. It's no longer provided by the caribou or by the seals. It's now waiting on the United States government to keep their word, which they don't do often, do they? Unless they say they're going to kill you, in which case it's probably pretty prompt that they're going to make the first attempt. Any government. We don't seem to be very nice when it comes to other people's ideas, while telling everybody they shouldn't care what anyone else thinks. It's absurd. Now we've got the bronze tools, and we always want to give Europe or Asia credit for bronze tools. That's fine. They were probably started in some country that was not the United States, because we don't find any bronze tools. Not Precolumbian anyway. The copper tools seem to be, well, discontinued in favor of stone tools. Now, why might that be? Well, we get to see the cultural importance of bronze in Europe, in China, and of course in North Africa and the Middle East even. Bronze was very important, but it also was not easy to outsource. It wasn't easy to get your hands on. When you have a drill that has a, well, let's use iron, right? The Iron Age eventually came around, and still Native Americans were using Stone Age tools. Tin was not something that was important. It was something that did exist. There are examples of pieces of really old metal, Precolumbian, that are tin in the United States. But let's say you're 4,000 miles from the nearest tool store. 4,000 miles to China, 4,000 miles to Great Britain, 4,000 miles from anywhere. Well, you've always got tools. There are always stones. There are always sticks. If you're out on the open ocean, you don't find either one of them, but what do you find? Animals. They got bones. And those bones can perform lots of different functions. If you lose a seal bone, well, you just got to go get yourself another seal. The weight is light. You can easily turn a shoulder bone from a caribou into a really nice saw. Instead of having to go to China to get the finest silks, and then going and getting some frankincense so that you can mix it in with a couple other local saps and spray it with that or paint it with that. Get yourself the highest dollar kayak you could in 1000 BC. It wasn't going to happen. You don't put a hole in your boat and go, all right, well, it's a good thing we still have that bolt of Asian fabrics here. No, mostly you're focusing on food, water, and shelter. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. To put a bronze tool in a boat like that to begin with, you're talking about a lot of weight. Yeah, you're talking about a tool that's got multiple uses, but it's been shown that shoulder blade adzes, as long as you're using them properly, are just as good as a copper one, just as good as a bronze one. Better than one made out of stone. The reason for that is because it's got some flex to it. It's got some give to it. When you look at a lot of the areas that the North Alaskans went through, it wasn't just snow area. Some of it was eventually. 5,000 years ago, most of that was mud flats. But eventually, a lot of that area had sticks that were growing fresh and green. And still, turn of the century, we had people that were going out on the beaches and pulling out driftwood in areas where the trees were plentiful. Why'd they do that? Well, that has a lot to do with its malleability. And also cultural understanding, I am assured. I've been told by enough people to believe that it is a cultural thing. That's one of the things about living in Washington State, getting to meet a lot of different people. A lot of people from Asia, a lot of Polynesians. I had a neighbor from Guam. He had a son who was around my age, and he was a lot smaller than me. And he was... his dad invited me over. They had a wedding, and it's customary to invite everybody. So they invited everybody. Everybody in the apartment complex was invited. They set out some big old long tables like they got at the church meals. a lot of different foods I'd never seen before, and it was pretty good. Now that idea of brotherhood and sisterhood among the Polynesian people, we don't hear about that, do we? We hear about the Maori warriors and going after Captain Cook. As far as the North Alaskans, and that's a little bit more appropriate than Eskimo, but not by much. Let's say you overturn your kayak and some stuff falls out. Everything is replaceable with what's around you, or with what you hunt. You can make your needles out of splinters of bone. You can make clothing out of pieces of bone, out of an animal's skin. You can use the fat for rubbing into the woods. Makes it more pliable. It also makes it more water resistant. Also, metal doesn't tend to hold up to the salt water so well. Bronze actually does. So, if somebody did do so, we might end up seeing some of these things in some of the salt flats that are being formed by glaciers melting. But when you are going to trade something, they're going to want something of value. What could you trade with Asia, basically, to bring across the ocean, bring to the United States, and trade for goods that people would want here? Well, a lot of the stuff that they have along the west coast of the United States is similar enough to stuff along the east coast of Asia that, like, for instance, the inside of our oyster shells. You can see both Native Americans and Japanese used oyster shells highly in decorative items, but it was sourced locally. Similar in color, there's no reason to take something like that from one side of the ocean to the other. It doesn't make any sense. You already have some. That'd be like, all right, in the ancient Roman times, they traded through India with China. So, what does China have that everybody wants? Silk. Buttworm juice. Solidified buttworm juice. Now, what if Rome already had silk? It wouldn't make any sense to establish that trade line for something that you've got in abundance. Now, let's say it was an item that everybody needed. Everybody needs salt. Well, everybody can take it off the ocean. There are plenty of examples of that. Ancient peoples harvested ocean salt. There are salt flats all over the Greek world. It's a salt flat. What do? They open up a gate. Ocean water flows in. They close the gate. They let the sun bake off all of the water. They scrape up the salt and they sell it. Most of these processes, they don't require metal tools. In the ancient world, metal was used sparingly because it wasn't necessary. When we talk about the copper tools that are here in North America, well, if you find it locally, that is completely different. It's worth it to try. You got time, you can do so. Make yourself a copper tool. You found this magic rock that has special properties. Yeah, by all means, do something with it. But also, you got to figure in that what kind of an item are you going to make out of it? Are you going to make a single-use item? It's been shown that stone arrowheads, especially flint arrowheads, You can stick them and stick them and stick them and stick them. Your chances of breaking the arrowhead are actually far less significant than we used to believe. One guy, he makes them, and the way that he tests his arrowheads is into a side of beef rib, like it's, a big chunk of cow ribs. These are thick, and he fires these stone arrows into it. And when he fires these stone arrows into it, it breaks maybe one out of every 20, 30 shots. He breaks the tip. So that's really not bad. I've probably broken more tips than that trying to pull practice arrows out of targets. Now, when you look at the North Alaskans, that's a throwaway weapon. You're not going to want to throw away something that's precious like that. When you're stuck in an ice field, you don't have trees all around you. You've got a bunch of ice and also some more ice, and on top of that, more ice. When it's really bright out and you don't want to get snow blind, you don't have the availability to go down to the local store and purchase yourself another set of sunglasses. No, what you do is you put a little lanyard on everything that you own, and you put a piece of softwood, something that's been extremely rotted, very dry rotted, and then when you put animal fat over the outside of it, it prevents any of the internal portion of it from getting water into it, so it's buoyant. If something falls out of your kayak, you can grab it. But also, you're going to make your own sunglasses. You're going to learn how to do that. You're also going to learn how to make your arrowheads out of bone. You're going to learn how to make your possibly even kayak and canoe parts out of bones. In more modern times, some of the beliefs were that you had to leave the bones where of a seal in specific, not a caribou, but a seal in specific. If you killed it, you could take everything but the bones. And that also depends on which cultures and which areas. And that gets into a lot of complications I'm not able to understand. Cultural differences. If people would have told me how Mary Mountain Sheep was going to treat me when I went to Hardin, Montana, I wouldn't have understood it. After being there, it's far more understandable. After being homeless, you understand the weight issue. It's not something that takes you 10 minutes, 20 minutes to pack up your car, and then you drive, 400 miles on vacation, and then you unpack everything, play with it a bit, and then drive back home. No, if you got to make a 400-mile journey, it's carrying it the old-fashioned way. So when you have a projectile that's attached to something, some of the oldest fishing spools that we've found are actually North Alaskan. But they weren't attached to arrows. It wasn't attached to a fishing rod. It was attached to a fishing spear. You got a small heft of wood, and if you don't have a heft of wood, there's some of them that were made by lashing and joining pieces of bone. That would have taken a lot of time, wouldn't it? But the idea is you've got a tip. It's a harpoon, literally, is what you're making. And the same as you would make teeth on a bone saw. You're not going to be sawing through bone with it necessarily, but you'll definitely be using it to saw through, any wood that you're going to be needing for your kayak. If you have to work through bone, that's where it's important to have a stone tool or 3 or 4, a few extras. But they're all replenishable by the next year. You wait for the ice to melt or the snow to melt, you pick up some more stones, you knock them into the shapes that you want. But if you figure, all right, you got to travel 4,000 miles to the nearest store. Is it worth it to you to get in your boat and sail all the way there for that one can of beans? Especially if it's life-threatening to get there, and cold and miserable. And then you have to trade half of everything that you got, if not all of it, for that one little chunk of shiny rock. And if you drop it, it's gone. Now, up in the North Alaskan area, I've been studying a lot of the paddles that are used worldwide. And something that they had was, it's a small paddle. It's about that big. And then it's got a little bit more for a handle. I mean, it's barely enough to hold on to. And it's attached to a lanyard and attached to your jacket via the lanyard. That way, if you drop it, you still have it handy. That's in addition to having your regular paddle. Always good to have a backup. The ones that are attached to your mittens or attached to your sleeves, those are your backups. I've been learning about a guy here in Oregon, in Portland. He makes a lot of skin-off kayaks and canoes. And he's a real big fan of the North Greenland kayak. Or sorry, East Greenland kayak. He also has his own version of a kayak that he made called an F1. It sounds cool, like a race car, don't it? F1, maybe a fighter jet. But no, it's just a kayak. But it's a cool kayak. Now, when you look at the advent of metal tools versus stone tools, there's not a lot of difference there. I mean, there is, but there isn't. When it comes to felling a tree, you can drop a tree with a stone axe, same as you can drop it with a metal axe. Around here, I can get a stone that is sufficient for making a stone axe in less than 10 minutes worth of walking. Up north, same thing. Alaska, same thing. There's rocks everywhere. Glacial regions tend to push a lot of tonnage when it comes to rocks. Now let's say your kids want Lucky Charms, right? But the nearest Lucky Charms is 60 miles away. Your local store, and that for the Native Americans, for the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Britons, your grocery store is what's around you. Are you going to travel all that way for a box of Lucky Charms when you can get the off-brand version at your local store? Probably not. If you're going to do it, you're going to want to make it worth your while. But then you're going to have to see what you have that's worth trading and what the people that you are trading with think is worthwhile. They have seashells. They don't want your fucking seashells. You look even among the Maori, many of their weapons were just wood. They were literally boat oars. Literally. You look at the Samoan War Club. It's a boat paddle. That's what it is. Being simplistic was important. Not creating a lot of issues logistically for yourself and for your family was important. One of the things that I look at today, a lot of Boy Scouts didn't actually read the book and certainly didn't try making stone tools. If you don't hand them the tools already prefabricated, they're not going to know what to do. When it comes to a file, when you got something that's metal, you're going to want a file or you're going to want a whetstone. That's a lot of extra weight to be carrying. You can carry a much smaller stone to sharpen a saw that's made of bone. It's also easier to keep it buoyant. It's also easier to pack it around with you. Basically, metal was not necessary. It was a liability. Becoming dependent upon metal items was a liability. The information that's lost when you become dependent upon technology removes the fact of reality. We got trees. We got rocks. We got these things all over the place. You take away guns, people still got knives. You take away knives, they still have sticks and fucking rocks. What are you making out of those sticks and rocks? Are you making an Apache war club? That's not a boat paddle. That's specifically made for bashing your skull in. How much weight does that thing have to it? When you're not a constantly moving society, you can afford to have more of that. When you have more acreage to put your stuff on, you can afford to do something like that. A lot of like the Tlingit, for example, they still exist in Washington State. They still hold to many of their traditions, including seagoing canoes. If you take a look at the traditional paddles that they use, they're very similar to Maori war clubs, which were also paddles. It's also where your spirit went, the paddle of your boat, because in the Tlingit society, they're war canoes, which weren't originally for war, they were for whaling, but whatever. The boat was for the village. The boat was for everyone. Everyone had a right to the boats. Your paddle is where you carved your spirit. Now, when you're talking about needing specialty tools, a lot of sculptors today wouldn't be able to make their own tools. They see their tools every day. They work with their tools every day. But how many of those people could go out and find their own clay? How many potters can build their own potter's wheel or even find suitable clay to make a pot out of? We've lost important portions of it. We've outsourced everything. A trade used to involve every aspect. When you were a potter back in the Middle Ages, you'd go out on the side of the road and you would literally dig yourself a spot and you'd do a few test digs, try to find yourself some clay, and then you'd have to sort the clay and get the big chunks out of it. If your tool broke down, you'd have to be able to go out into the woods, harvest yourself some sticks and some fucking rocks, and fix it your goddamn self. Now, if your machine breaks, you have to call a repairman. You end up with about 30 or 40 people in between all involved, and each one of them wants to get a paycheck. So now you're spending a lot more time trying to earn the money to pay off something that you could have learned how to do yourself in 30 minutes. You can learn how to make a rope. The entire process. You can learn how to make a rope out of trees, out of brush, out of grass, out of all sorts of different stuff. You can learn how to do it in about 5 minutes. You can learn how to harvest stuff and a lot of little quick tips of the trade, all in about 5 minutes. Is it going to take you 5 minutes to make a rope? No, it'll take you longer than that. But you can practice. You can find yourself a piece of string or maybe even a rubber band. This is a big rubber band. You can practice twisting it. What happens when you twist it? Grab it in the middle. Twist itself up. Now, after you've done it, you've got a visual reference once you've watched a YouTube video. But you got a better reference by practicing and trying it yourself. Sure, your rope is going to come out looking like shit the first time, and you might even throw it away after making it the first time and going, man, I ain't no good at that. But if you run into a survival situation where you need it, even that one little practice thing that you threw away, that's enough to give you the confidence that you could do it. It may not look pretty, but you can make it work. And that's a lot of what we miss today. A lot of people have zero confidence. They don't understand, apparently, that, well, for literally hundreds of thousands of years, over 100,000 years at least, human beings have been utilizing and using tools. Sticks and rocks. Not tools, these are literally sticks and fucking rocks. Now, a lot of y'all, you don't think the internet can be destroyed. Well, maybe not entirely. But if we end up with a giant economic mess, or bombs hitting in the right places, or diseases making it so people can't go to work, we could very much end up in a situation where, in order to get your computer working, you obviously don't have a store to go to anymore to get new parts. So once it's fucked, it's fucked. It's like getting an old Atari running. You better be real good with electronics. There's a store here that actually does that. They buy old busted Ataris from garage sales. And they got a guy who sits there with a soldering iron and makes that shit work again. Like magic. But that also requires an education. Now, humans are resilient. You know, living in North Alaska, living in an area that's mostly ice and snow most of the year. You're going to be minimalistic. You're not going to want to carry around 8 pounds worth of hammers. You're not going to want to carry around 14 pounds worth of housing gear. Just like with a mountaineer, you establish yourself a base camp. Once your base camp is established, you've got your own emergency equipment that you take with you. That being your kayak. If you're in a bad area, a bad storm comes up and you have to get out of the water, you have to get onto a chunk of ice, well, you can flip your kayak upside down and sleep inside of it. Turn it at a little bit of an angle. And one of the videos I was watching, they were showing how it's done. And I thought, that's genius. You can still breathe. The snow is packed up enough to where you're not bending the frame out of shape. It's resting on the snow. And you're not getting wet. you're still getting enough air in there to breathe. And well, I couldn't imagine doing that with the kayak that's on top of my car. It's modern. It's very impact resistant. I would definitely actually trust it more for being impact resistant than I would a native kayak with the seal skin. But not by much. With the trade as far as the Aleutian Islands, carrying it up north, across the top of Canada, all the way to the Great Lakes, and of course to the East Coast, there was an extensive trade network, and we have evidence of that. We have evidence of Northwest carvings as far east as Illinois. That's pretty far. And if it hadn't been found in the region that it was, it would not have been preserved, because a lot of that up at the northern border is real wet and shifting sands. Wet shifting sands equals a lot of air getting in there and a lot of moisture getting in there, a lot of quick rot. If you go to Washington State, for example, you go to Tacoma, you dig yourself a hole that's 6 inches, 8 inches deep, you drop in a 4-inch thick piece of wood, you put the top cover back on top of it, forget about it for a year, and go dig it up again. It's going to be really soft, it's going to be lightweight, and you're going to go, it's going to fall right in half. If you do that in the Sahara Desert, well, all the moisture is baked out of it quickly. The sand lets a lot of air get in there, but eventually you're going to get trap sand, and that's a lot of the micro stuff that falls down and settles, and it'll settle on top of stuff and actually prevent oxygen from getting to it anymore, and moisture won't actually seep that deep. So it's a very complicated thing, but it's also a matter of needs versus wants. When you've got a place to build a giant stone palace, and you have a shit ton of stones and a shit ton of people there, then it's easy to get yourself a big stone palace. But when you're out on the open ocean, you're not going to be having all that stone that you can work with. That's going to be real heavy. It's going to be something that is not worth it to make it on the trip. A lot of the reason that the North Alaskans used bone for a lot of their spearfishing and things of that nature is because bone was easily replenishable year-round. There's one area up there where they found a whole bunch of bones, but some of them had pieces and sections sawed out of them. So this is obviously where people dump mass quantities of the same animal. It's probably an area where people had a long-term settlement there, in an ice field, mind you. But also it shows signs that different portions of it were used for making sunglasses. Different portions were used for what they believe were kayak ribs. For you to take a bone knife and get the meat off of a seal, it's pretty easy. They showed how it's done on one of the videos I was watching, and I was looking at that and thinking, I've done that with PVC. I've sharpened up PVC because I needed to cut something without risk of electric shock. So I know that it works. I know it's functional. I know I can cut through copper wire with a PVC knife, and bone is a lot more structurally sound. It's got a grain to it, which It's definitely important to know and understand if you're going to make different tools like needles. You're going to do some sewing. I should probably end this video. I've been ranting for a bit. I guess I just wanted to point out that just because something exists don't mean you need it. The Spartans lived very minimalistic. Those in North Alaska lived very minimalistic. Those in the Aleutian Island chain were a lot less minimalistic. Used a lot more in their construction, made longer canoes, longer kayaks. And there's actually signs that both societies of Tlingit and Aleut, they lived side by side and traded with one another often and frequently, even though they were entirely different societies. You look at the Aleutian Island chain, some of those islands are occupied by Tlingit and some of them were occupied by Aleut. Most of them were Aleut, and the Tlingit were all along the coast, which is really cool too. You basically see these two strips. One of those strips is the Aleutian chain, and that's where the Aleutian peoples lived. And then you have the coast of the United States, which goes right along the Aleutians. Now, I didn't pay as much attention as I could have in Northwest history. Most of that is because the teacher made it fun, and so we did goof around a little bit in class, but we retained what we learned. But, of course, it was a required course in Washington State, just as Nebraska history is important in Nebraska. If you ask me what the capital of Nebraska is, I was born in Nebraska. I'll only get it right maybe half the time. There's stuff that you need to know and stuff that you don't. It depends on where you live and what you're living in. You'll probably never need to know how to spearfish. Let's hope you never need to know how to spearfish, because most of you don't know how to make a spear anyway. Quick tip for you. If you're spearfishing, you're going to want to slice some gouges and some notches in your spear. That's not a kill count. That's so that it'll actually grab the fish on the end of your spear, instead of you poking it and it sliding right back out. All you've done there is critically injure a fish and guarantee that you're still going to go hungry. And you burnt some calories and you're probably frustrated.